Hello, my name is Karen Bolton, and I'm the CEO of Nettitude. And today I have the pleasure of talking to you about physical disability and the accessibility challenges associated with people with physical disabilities entering the cybersecurity workforce. There's a little bit about me on the screen, but candidly, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about my background professionally, but more about why I have some knowledge around this area. So when I'm not working, one of my great passions is actually working in the adaptive sports community. I am a board member of the North Jersey Navigators. I'm also a track and field coach. I've been certified by US Track and Field, and I work with adaptive athletes. And it's such a great environment to operate in. And it's really given me some very interesting insight into how people face off to the world. And I want to be able to tell you a little bit more about that today through some eyes of some individuals, but more about that in a moment. Today, I'm hoping that we can accomplish three important objectives together. First of all, I'd really like to be able to raise awareness with you all about the physically disabled community, allow you to understand a little bit more about what's important to them and how they can contribute to society at large. Secondly, I'd really like to be able to inspire you to have you engage further with the physically disabled community in a way that enables you all to educate them further about the opportunities that a career in cybersecurity may actually represent for them. And finally, I really would like to challenge organizations around how they could improve inclusion for individuals with disability. And I really thought that today it would be helpful if I provided you all with a view about physical disability actually through the eyes of some other folks in addition to myself. So first of all, and I'm going to just to provide some context as we go through, I'm going to use them to tell some stories and give you some examples of different things for you all to think about. So let me introduce three people. So first of all, you probably recognize the fact that the last name of the first individual is the same as mine. So yes, that is my daughter, Sarah Bolton. She is a senior in high school, and that means she's in her final year before she'll go off to university. She's an actor, she's a singer, she's an athlete. She actually does track, field, and basketball. And you can see her there pictured on the left in her basketball wheelchair. And sitting next to her is a gentleman by the name of Ryan Martin. Ryan Martin is a professional basketballer. He's the president of his own foundation, the Ryan Martin Foundation. And in addition to that, he's actually the director of inclusive sports at the City University of New York, or what we call here in New York, CUNY. So he's got a lot of experience in not just about what it means for him to work, but also how does he help people at his university become engaged in the professional community and in across a vast number of opportunities and careers. And finally, who's not pictured, Celeste Lopez. So I met Celeste actually commuting on the train into New York, where I live. Celeste and I met on the train together, and Celeste is actually visually impaired. She's aided by her wonderful guide dog. And so I get the great fortune of being able to travel on the train with Celeste and her dog. I want to say every day, but of course we all know that since COVID, our whole work practices have changed entirely. And so it's not every day anymore. But nonetheless, let me tell you a little bit about Celeste. She's actually a lawyer. She works in the district attorney's office within the borough of Brooklyn here in New York. So before we go on and talk about some of the challenges and what we need to think about when we're talking about folks with physical disability, I thought, first of all, it would be worthwhile just giving everybody a sense of what do we mean by somebody with a physical disability and what are the breadth of different types of physical disability. And I will say this, I'm greatly generalizing when I make these categories, so I want to make sure that I'm clear about that from the get-go, but I think it just gives everybody a broad understanding of what we're talking about. So first of all, one large group is the group with motor function impairment. Now, That group in itself can be quite vast. So first of all, you may have somebody who is an amputee, so loss of one or multiple limbs. Somebody may have a motor function disability associated with a limb. So they may have a limb or limbs, but those limbs may not work as effectively as what we would call able-bodied individuals. And of course, finally, there are the wheelchair-enabled group. And I always like to call them wheelchair-enabled rather than disabled. I think that they definitely appreciate that label. Then there's the visually impaired, and that could be partial impairment, limitations on sight. It could actually be total blindness. Folks with auditory impairment, loss of hearing, complete deafness. And then, of course, there's the group with dwarfism, or what they like to be called, which is little people. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the different types of physical disability. And I think it's important to understand that they're very, very different, and individual needs are very, very different. And I'm going to come on to that again further in a moment. But first of all, I think it's really helpful to get a sense of some of the challenges that folks with physical disabilities experience. And as I said, I'm going to kind of, as I go through this list, I want to talk about it through the eyes of some of these individuals that I've already introduced to you, plus others. So the first and most obvious, and I think that the physical accessibility is the most obvious challenge. And I think the biggest challenge for folks is that for the rest of us, that's where our thought process stops, actually. And it's important that it doesn't. But first of all, physical disability, that can be physical accessibility, that can be as simple as, is there a ramp to get into where somebody needs to go if they're in a wheelchair? What are the steps like? Are there railings? Are there elevators? All those really simple things. Is there the ability to open the door through a button, for example? All the really simple things. And what I think about on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you like, which is that's basic food and water. And it's interesting, both my daughter and Ryan are the same on this one, right? Which is, if they're going to a store, for example, they won't frequent and support organisations or stores that don't allow access for them in wheelchairs, not even if they needed to shop with them online. They kind of go, okay, if you're not prepared to provide access to me, then I guess that means you don't want me as a customer. And I think it's important to sort of think about that and understand that that kind of mindset occurs, and particularly as we think about how do we provide accessibility for folks working in our organisations. Transportation is another great challenge. How well can you navigate the transport system if you're relying on the public transport system? How accessible is parking if you're driving? In the case of Celeste, she doesn't drive, she relies on public transport. By the large part, navigating that transportation system with her dog works pretty well for her, actually, as long as the system doesn't go wrong. Celeste and I ended up together one day where we got really stuck, and so I think she was appreciative of the fact that I was actually with her that day. But for the large part, she's able to negotiate it. Both Sarah and Ryan, for example, they both drive. So getting to an organisation, they're able to deal with that. What's the parking lot? Is there disabled parking available? All of these things become really important considerations. Another challenge for folks with physical disability is time. I think time is a really important one to understand. I think as able-bodied individuals, we take for granted how quickly we can get up, get on about our day, get out the door, get to where we need to go. I know with having Sarah in the house, just how much extra time it takes for her to prepare for the day. It just takes longer to get ready. It takes longer to get out to the car. She's got to mobilize the ramp system in her car to be able to get into her car. She drives to school now, which is, candidly fantastic for us. But nonetheless, these are all things, everything takes a little bit longer in time. I've had conversations with Celeste. She's got to think about what time she gets up. She's got to make sure her dog gets exercise before she even thinks about going off to work. She gets picked up by a transport service in order to bring her to the train station. That takes extra time. So if I just look at Celeste and my day and compare the two of them, her day on average is about 2 to 2.5 hours longer than what mine can be, simply because of the physical accessibility needs that she has and how she needs to make sure that she prepares for her day. Another great challenge, of course, is social isolation. And I think actually, in many respects, the recent pandemic has made that worse for folks with physical disabilities than it's made it better. There have been some advantages. We'll talk about that in a moment, but certainly social isolation is a big one. And, how well are they embraced by the communities in which they operate? And I think it's great when you're in an adaptive sports community, for example, right? Because you're together with other folks who have other challenges. But what about when you're in the workforce, for example? How well will you be integrated into the organisation and accepted by the organisation becomes really interesting. General health and wellness. Oftentimes, folks with physical disabilities can have other challenges associated with their disability. My daughter, for example, her disability is caused by a motor neuron disease that affects her motor ability. So, of course, there's going to be other challenges that need to be managed by that individual. There's the perception gap. Now, this one's a really interesting one. And as I interviewed both Ryan and Sarah, they both brought it up in a very different way, but still the same. And the thing is, both of them talk about the fact they don't see themselves as different. They don't see themselves as having a disability. Yet, I'm sure when you look at those photos that I just showed you, or when you see somebody in a wheelchair, or you see somebody with a leg amputation who's walking with a prosthetic, they may be walking with a limp or whatever it is, you may see them as different, but they don't see themselves as different. I think it's really important to think about that. I think it's very important to think about that, particularly in an organisation setting, in terms of how they're perceived. And of course, there's the societal stereotypes that always need to be addressed. Are they seen as being less intelligent because they might have a physical disability? That happens often. Are they seen as they won't be able to do something because they're in a chair, because they don't have a limb? I can assure you, their ability to accomplish things is far greater than any of us ever imagine it to be. And that's where it becomes really important, and where the challenges of assumptions lie as well, right? People make assumptions about what someone might be capable of not capable of, without really asking and understanding with the individual. Another great one is their need to have to demonstrate independence. Ryan told me a story about job interviews that he's been on, and how he always makes sure when he's on a job interview, number one, he has his car keys in his hands, so he's signaling the fact that he can drive. He'll open the door for the person who's interviewing. He will insist on moving the chair in a meeting room rather than having somebody else do it. Why? Because he wants to be able to demonstrate that he's independent and able to function independently, just like an able-bodied person. That's a tough hill to climb, and having to feel the need to prove all the time, I think it's a really interesting challenge. And then finally, I bring up the burden of inspiration. My daughter in particular just gets tired of hearing, Sarah, you're such an inspiration to us. You're such an inspiration to us. They just want to be like everybody else. And I think that that's something that I would ask that you all think about as you start preparing for your next segment. You're going to be preparing for a workshop. Just think about some of those challenges. Think about perhaps your own biases. Think about the lenses that you've looked at people before with physical disability. Can you imagine any of these? Have you played a role in any of those challenges? And how could you potentially change your behaviour? So hopefully by now you've had the realization that the challenge to be addressed for the physically disabled community isn't actually about accessibility. It's actually about inclusion. There's an amusing but I think quite accurate saying that we use in the physically disabled community, and it's that physical disability is considered the pinky finger of inclusion. So it's the last thing that people think about. And the reason for that is because people think it's solved by accessibility. You know, if I put a button on the door, if I make sure there's ramps, if I make sure there's an escalator, everything else is solved for. When really, I think that the true breakthroughs will occur when it's truly thought about from a position of inclusion rather than from a position around accessibility. And if you think about it, there's huge benefits, not just to us as employers for inclusion, but actually also for society at large. Like, so just think about it. Like, I always think about the impact when I watch Sarah, for example, and the impact that she's had on people, not because she intended to have an impact, but just because that impact happened as a result of her interaction, her involvement, her inclusion. So, you know, and think about if you were working with folks with physical disabilities in your building. Other companies in your building would see those folks. They'd benefit from their presence. What about the restaurants and the stores around the area where your place of work is, and the fact that they would have to accommodate folks? Think about that kind of follow-on impact. I think it could be extremely significant. And the other thing that I would say is that when a person with a physical disability feels included, they feel incredibly valued. They're also going to be very, very loyal. Statistics demonstrate that people with physical disabilities are less likely to change employers as often, and that's simply because they value the security and inclusion so much that they don't want to take the risk that it won't be the experience somewhere else. So I think that really speaks to the fact that there are significant opportunities that we could embrace as an industry to really make a difference in this area. So, you know, first of all, let's talk about what does it mean to have a culture of inclusivity? You know, what could you do as a culture in the organization to be able to drive inclusivity in the organization? And, you know, I was talking to Ryan about how does he assess that in organizations? And let's bear in mind, this is a man who has an opportunity to visit many, many, many organizations. He's quite an inspirational speaker. He gets invited into organizations to talk to organizations. He told me a story about an organization who he recently visited, and the goal was for him to come and speak about inclusion in the workplace. And he told me an interesting story, and I'll spare the identity of who the organization was. Large organization, very, very well known. He had to go and speak. He had to go up on stage. No problem. There was access available to go up on stage. However, once he got backstage, what he needed to do in order to be able to get onto the stage was move a whole bunch of buckets and mops that had just been left in the corridor. So, you know, his point to that was, here I was going into this organization being asked to talk about inclusion for folks with physical disability, and yet there were just these little signals that showed that it wasn't a true culture of inclusion just by the way that he had to go in and navigate that type of environment. Now, of course, he navigated it because I go back to the point that I made earlier, which is he wanted to make sure that he could prove his independence, right? A thing that they feel like they have to prove all the time. Nonetheless, it's worth thinking about. When he was being employed at CUNY and they were going through the interviewing process, what did they do? They came to Connecticut, which is where he's based. They came to Connecticut to meet with him. They thought about that in the hiring process as what that culture of inclusivity would mean. How to make sure that we make people valued members of the team. And I think that that's a practice that's true candidly for many individuals. You know, perhaps you've got that person in your team that is quieter than everybody else. But yet when they make a point, their point's a really, really good one, but sometimes they can be overshadowed by other people in the team. How do you validate them, make them feel valued in the team? It's the same thing. That's what people with physical disabilities, they want to be able to experience. They want to know that they are a valued member of the team and that they get invited. And you can do that in any number of ways. My daughter is just starting in a new play, and this is with the school. And one of the storylines in this particular play actually has a character who has cerebral palsy. And the casting director at the school was absolutely insistent on the fact that Sarah would not play that part. He did not want her to be stereotyped. He wanted her to feel like her acting value to the cast was as valuable as everybody else. She didn't get the lead role, but she got one of the main character roles. And so just having that signal that he wasn't prepared to just stereotype her into a particular role, but that he was prepared to consider everybody for all roles, really signaled to her that she was a valuable member of this cast. And I think that we could carry that over into a working community as well. We all know that we've been through a really, really tough pandemic, and in fact, we continue to live in that pandemic. One of the things that actually has been a bit of a blessing for the physically disabled community is the fact that it's opened the eyes of organisations to the fact that there are many, many different ways of working, and that we can have flexible ways of working, and that really provides opportunity for folks with physical disabilities. It really enables them to find different ways of working. I think it opens new opportunities. I can't see any reason why, for example, within Nettitude, why anybody with a physical disability could not work with us. There's absolutely no excuse, no reason. And I think that we could establish some really interesting, flexible ways of working that would work for people with physical disability. And I guess, if there's anything around what we've learned here, the one great fear that I have as we come out of this pandemic is that we don't continue to embrace the positives that have come out of it. And it's true of any situation, right? There's, even in the greatest of negatives, there are positives that come out of things. And I think that that's upon us as organisations to make sure that we continue to embrace the positive things that have come out of this pandemic. And obviously, I think flexible ways of working is a tremendous way to really support folks with physical disability. Role models. Role models are really, really valuable. I see that in the disabled community all of the time. My daughter, she has a role model in Ali Stroker. Ali Stroker is a performer. She's performed on Broadway. She's a singer. She is in a wheelchair. And just the great inspiration that I think that presents to my daughter is fantastic. I think that we can create role models in our own organisations. And of course, I think that when folks with physical disability are looking for role models in organisations, they're not just looking necessarily for other folks with physical disability, but they're also looking at the ways in which our organisations treat all forms of minority. Ryan talks about when he goes into organisations, how many women does he see? How many folks of colour does he see? How many other minorities? How does he see people interacting in the organisation? To him, that's a great way of seeing positive role modelling behaviour within organisations. And, I've got a picture here on the screen, but, that's a photo that he would say, if he was going past that image in an organisation, what a positive role model environment that creates, and that really helps people understand and appreciate how to create an inclusive culture. Is it a workplace of expressive freedom? Are people able to express who they are? That is a really great indicator that people with physical disabilities will be embraced in the environment, accepted in the environment, included in the environment. Now, I don't mean that people get the opportunity to politicized beliefs and things like that, right? Of course, you want to have an environment that is a positive environment, but the fact that people are able to express themselves freely, I think, is a great indicator of an inclusive environment, and one that is going to encourage and invite people with physical disabilities to want to be part of. There are organizations out there and foundations, one like I spoke about relative to Ryan's, where engagement with those can really help us create opportunities in our industry. So, for example, CUNY is establishing an advisory board for how to bring folks with physical disability into workplaces. And I know Nettitude is going to engage with that advisory board, because I think that provides opportunity for us to find ways of bringing in people with disabilities into the organisation. And I think that there's many organisations out there in many different states within the United States, in many different areas and regions within the UK, other parts of Europe. I think that there's opportunity that as organisations we could take advantage of, and I'm not sure that we necessarily are. And I think that presents an interesting challenge for us. If we are going to make a difference and really make change, the way to do that is with intention, with intention of our practices. And as I was thinking about where priority could be placed around that intention, I really thought that the most positive impact could come from impacting these 4 areas. So hiring, performance management, career development, and internships. What are the practices that exist in our organizations today? And are there practices within those areas unintentionally that are creating a disadvantage for folks with disability? And what can we do to overcome it? So, for example, when somebody applies into our organization, do we ask them first and foremost, what assistance do they need through the hiring process? And I think it's really important to understand this. Individuals are able to tell us what help that they need, and every individual needs something different. And I want to come back to that point, because I think it's really, really important for us to understand. And then if we can create an environment whereby we can make sure that it truly is a level playing field, that folks with physical disability are able to achieve the same outcomes as their able-bodied counterparts, I think that's where we can really make a difference. And you're going to have the opportunity in a moment with a workshop, and I really want to encourage you to highlight on that. And then the last point I would make is, can we take a 504 approach? And what does that mean? So in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act has this section 504 that basically says that people who receive and organisations who receive funding from the federal government need to make sure that people with physical disabilities can participate like everybody else. Could we take that approach as employers and really take an individual approach? So if you recall, when we started this presentation today, I said I had 3 objectives in mind: to create awareness. I think you've all heard a lot of information today, so I'm hoping that you are more aware than when you started. To inspire you to engage further. And finally, to challenge organisations on how we create a more accessible environment for people with physical disability. I want you to remember that it really comes down to accessibility is that's the first step. True inclusion is really the goal. And if we act with intention, that's the best way for us all to be able to achieve that goal. I'm really happy. If anybody has any questions or you want to follow up, my email address is on the screen there. Please feel free to reach out to me. I would very much enjoy engaging in any further conversation around this topic. You're now going to go into a workshop to think about how you can create greater accessibility, and you can bring your own ideas to the table, and hopefully you can apply some of the things that we've talked about today as you go through that thought process. Thank you very much for your time.